In most economic crises, a larger proportion of working men than working women lose their jobs. Well, not so for COVID-19, it seems. So how severe and how permanent have these COVID-19 she-cessions been? Hello, Francesca. Welcome.
Hi, Tim. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Now, Francesca, as I said in the introduction, in other recessions, there's usually more job loss for working men than for working women. Why is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So several studies have been pointing to this evidence of men sessions, so-called men sessions, where actually men have worse labor market outcomes during the crisis than women. And the reason of this is that during typical crises, including the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis, men are typically more employed in very cyclical sectors such as construction and manufacturing, whereas women are largely employed in services or public administrations that are typically less cyclical. So in our paper, we confirm this evidence during the GFC, and we find that at the trough of the 2009 recession, about 92% of the countries that we have in our sample experienced a men sessions. And by the end of 2009, actually 95% of countries in our sample were in a men session. So we do observe this evidence of worse labor market outcome for men than women during typical crises.
But this time last year, we found something different, didn't we? We found she-cessions. So why is that? And how big is the difference in the other direction?
Yeah, so this time around, we find evidence of she-cessions. So women are disproportionately hit by the pandemic crisis. And the reason is that this crisis is atypical along many dimensions with respect to atypical recessions. First, one important reason is that contact-intensive sectors were hit the hardest, due both to lockdown measures that government introduced, but also due to the fact that people voluntarily social distance because they feared catching the virus. And as I already hinted to, contact-intensive sectors, which are typically services, are sectors with higher shares of women's employment. So this is the first factor. The second factor is clearly school closures. So school closures impacted women disproportionately because working women tend to carry higher childcare burden within the household. So all these factors contributed to the evidence that in the first months of the pandemic, women's unemployment experienced higher rises than that of men. And so we call this a she-cession. Just to make sure, I define exactly how we define a she-cession in our work. So in our work, we focus on employment levels, and we define a country as being in a she-cession in a quarter in 2020 if women's unemployment rate falls more than men's compared to 2019. And based on this indicator of she-cession, we find evidence that over half to 2/3 of the countries in the sample experienced a she-cession in the second quarter of 2020, which is the trough of the pandemic recession. Again, one considering employment levels.
Yes, I remember the early work. It really did focus almost exclusively on the US, didn't it? I mean, clearly the data's easier to find there. You've investigated a lot more countries in a longer period. So which countries have you included and what period have you looked at this time?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in our work, our motivation were really to have a more global perspective and go beyond the US, which, as you rightly said, was the focus of most of the earlier work this year because of better data, clearly. But however, the US are hardly representative of the average labor market. So we did a big effort in collecting more data, and we ended up with a panel of 38 countries, 30 advanced economies, and 8 emerging markets and developing economies. And so when we focus on our full sample of 38 countries, we observed that 60% of the countries experienced a she-cession in the second quarter of 2020, When we zoom in on advanced economies, that number is a bit lower and it's equal to about 63%. Unfortunately, a worse pattern is visible when we focus on emerging markets only, with 88% of countries in a she-cession in the second quarter of 2020.
And what has the story been since then? Are they all still experiencing a she-cession?
Well, the quick answer is no. In fact, another important result of our work, I think, is that there is a large degree of heterogeneity across countries. So she-cessions are by no means a universal phenomenon. And also their severity differs significantly across countries. So just to give you an idea, in our sample, 2 countries experience this relatively gender gap changes of about 5%, several above 1, few close to 0, but also some countries experienced men's sessions of the same order of magnitude. And so when looking at also at the persistence of this phenomenon, we see that the good news is that she-cessions seem to be short-lived, particularly in advanced economies. In fact, in the third quarter of 2020, only 45% of the countries in the sample were in a she-cessions, and this might reflect the fact that restrictions were eased and schools were reopened in this quarter. Whereas again, emerging markets appear to be in a slightly worse situation, with she-cessions being more persistent, with 75% of the countries still in a she-cession in the third quarter. And just to also sort of give a broader perspective, even though in our somehow limited time sample we observe that these gaps are closing, this doesn't mean that the pre-existing gender gaps between the levels of men's and women employment rates is also closing. This gap might still remain going forward.
I mean, this is, well, it's limited good news, isn't it, Francesca? But it occurs to me it might not tell the whole story, because do we know as well if women and men who stayed in employment were working the same hours, or did men have their hours cut more than women?
Yeah, that's absolutely important to consider this aspect as well, because employment levels might mask other margins that in fact can be particularly important to assess the gender impact of this specific crisis. And as you said, our work is one of those. So the so-called intensive margin of labor is particularly important during this crisis, for instance, because many countries deployed short-term work schemes to sort of help workers cope with the crisis. And these short-term work schemes are aimed at preserving job links while reducing labor costs on the side of the employers. So in our sample, when we looked at our average hours worked, we find a sort of counterintuitive results, a bit in contrast with our prior, and we find that men have typically seen average hours worked fall by more than women, which is, as I said, surprising and kind of in contrast with what we saw for the US, for instance. So we conclude that in our sample, she-cessions gender gaps are far more evident along the extensive margin of labor markets, namely employment, rather than in the intensive margin, which is average hours worked.
Is it also possible that as COVID-19 dragged on, more women than men just exited the labor force completely, which again would bias your statistics, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, labor force participation it's another important margin to consider, especially because women may have opted out of the labor market in greater numbers because they had to care for their children who were out of school or possibly still are. So, and another factor is also that at the very beginning of the pandemic, entire sectors had to shut down. And so workers in those sectors who were laid off simply ceased to participate in labor markets. So they exited the labor force. And our results suggest that much of the relative employment decline indeed reflects women's greater propensity to exit the labor force with respect to men. Again, this is probably partly due to the fact that working mothers had to stay home to care for children. And also there is some evidence in the literature that those particularly affected are the lower income and the lower skilled working mothers. And there is some nice evidence in a paper of my co-author Marina that can zoom in on this more micro aspect. And it's we don't do this in our paper, but that's also an important aspect to consider.
What's the policy implication here, Francesca? It sounds like maybe what we should be doing is looking at policies that are targeted to help women, especially those in those sectors most effective, as you say, to help them rejoin the labour force. Is that something we could do? What would we do if we did that?
Yeah, no, we should do that. In fact, our sort of policy implications in the paper is that to reduce these gaps, policymakers should first prioritize the reopening of schools, so safely reopen schools. Second, ensure that affordable childcare is available to all, but also that family leave is available for both men and women, so both mothers and fathers can take care of their kids. And there is also some flexibility in working hours, so to sort of adjust during this very uncertain time yet. And more generally, in our sort of related work that we did in the context of the IMF World Economic Outlook, we show that this shock has been highly asymmetric, not only across gender, but across also other socioeconomic groups. And in fact, this recession has been heavily impacting youth and the lower workers. So in this context, while the shock is still ongoing, job retention policies, such as the short-term work scheme that I mentioned before, can be very powerful in mitigating the negative effect of the shocks. And we, in fact, observed that these measures were essential in keeping unemployment from rising even further. Well, as the economy reopens, as the recovery is underway, worker reallocation policies should boost job creations and then help easing the labor market adjustment. So to conclude, it is really essential for policies to help workers participating in the labor market by providing support to working parents through childcare, support workers that are unable to continue working because of lockdown measures, and also going forward, help workers transitioning to growing sector in the economy as the recovery is underway.
Well, the shocks are a year old. It's fascinating how much we are still learning about the impact, the differential impact of it on different people. But so thank you very much for doing this work and for talking about it to me today, Francesca. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Have a good day.
The paper's called Gender and Employment in the COVID-19 Recession, Evidence on She-cessions. And the authors are John Bludorn, Francesca Caselli, Niels Jakob Hansen, Ipei Shibata and Marina Tavares. It's in COVID Economics 76. There's also a Vox EU article on the same topic, same authors. Thanks for watching. Remember, all the latest research on the impact of COVID-19 is in COVID Economics, and it's free and open access at CEPR.org.